All right, we'll say good morning, good morning. To everyone, let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, to thank Josh and Becca Friedman for dedicating all the Shirman and Roshos this month. Le'ilui Nishmas, Josh's father, Yisrael Yehuda Ben Rav Chaim Rafael Zichron Lebracha. To thank Sammy and Malka Esterson for dedicating all the Shirman and Roshos this month in memory of their parents. Yitzchak Leibet Ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, and Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, whose yahrzeit is today. And of course, in the continued merit and kinsuchos of Mr. Morton Esther Sidar Meh Ve'esim Shanim Tovos. To thank the Pepper Mishpacha for dedicating the Shir Midrashos this month, the commission of the yahrzeit of Yosef Pepper, Shmuel's brother, Yosef David Zichron Livracha Ben Yaakov. We hope that the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamos will have an aliyah, and the family Zainachama. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Nun Vav 56, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Nun Vav. We are picking up on Nun Hey Amud Beis 55b. We actually left off right in the middle of the Mishnah. So we left off 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. 15 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, just to orient ourselves a little bit. So the Mishnah, once again, is talking about a person who makes a neder. And as has been our topic throughout the last number of sugyas, we're focusing here on how we define the particular lashon that is used by an individual. So in this particular Mishnah, we're speaking about the idea that a person made a neder not to benefit from clothing, from ksus. So we were discussing what's included in ksus, what's excluded from ksus. So now Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says as follows. Rabbi Yehuda says, Hakol fi hanoder. Shavuot says it's actually quite interesting. Rabbi Yehuda says when it comes to defining the nature and the scope of a neder, not only do we look at the definition of the particular words being used, but we also look at the circumstances of the person making the neder. So we'll say this is really very interesting. So remember, up until now, what we've been looking at is you make a neder, you employ certain wording, certain verbiage, so then we look, okay, how is that verbiage normally used? Rabbi Yehuda says we also look at the actual physical circumstances of the individual to interpret his particular neder. So for example, listen to this. Ta'an, vizya, let's say a person was carrying wool. Ta'an means carrying. A person was carrying wool, vizya, he was sweating, vayarecho kasha, and as a result of all of his sweating, he had terrible body odor. And he says, Amar konam tsemer ufishtim alai, ola alai. And he says, konam, I make an eder that wool and linen should not come upon me. Should not go on, should not come upon me. So what's the halacha? Mutar lehiskasos va'asra lahavshila chorav. He is permitted to wear clothing of wool and linen, obviously not wool and linen together, that's shatnez, but clothing of wool or clothing of linen, but he is not permitted to carry a bundle of wool or linen behind him. They will say, what's the pshat over here? Since he's making this neder at a time that he's schlepping wool and linen, and obviously it's not going well for him. We've all had days like that, a lot of schwitzing, a lot of body odor, right? So what happens? So when he makes the neder, we interpret the neder in the context of his present circumstances. So we understand the neder, therefore, to be about carrying wool or linen, not about wearing wool or linen. Good. So Tanya, both say the Gemara just elaborates on this. So the Brisa says, Hanodim in aksus. A person makes a neder not to wear ksus, again, not to wear clothing. So mutar besak or biyariya or bichamila. So we'll say, so again, is really the Bryce is just elaborating on the Mishnah. So he's allowed to wear this sackcloth, yariya and chamila are almost like these thick curtain-like materials. V'aser bepunda or bepsakya or besakurtia or bekatablia va'anpila. Ufalinya umichnasayim vikova. Okay, so what are all of these things? So let's define some of our terms over here. So first off, if you take a look at the Ran, so the Ran says 3, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom. Punda is azur chalo, is a hollow belt. That's a punda. Sakartia katablia, the Ran says kulam mine mabushim shal ar. These are all different types of garments that are made of leather. Okay, the mefarish. So again, as well say. So let's now the Gemara is going to define some of them. My is kurti. What's his kurti? Amar barachano kituna ditzala. It's a leather shirt. A leather shirt. Tanya yotzin bisak ava ubisagus ava ubiyiria ubichamila. So I'll say now we're switching gears for just a moment. So up until now, this has been a discussion about Nedarim and trying to figure out what's included in the lashon of ksus, what's not included in the lashon of ksus. Now the Gemara is bringing a brisa from Masechah Shabbos. Now this brisa is talking about what you're allowed to go out with on Shabbos, what you're not allowed to go out with on Shabbos. So remember from our Shabbos days in general, when it comes to items that go, but usually used against some type of curtain material, so you're allowed to go ahead and wear these things out on Shabbos to protect you against the rain. Against the rain. Ava lo beteva, velo bekupa, velo machatzalas, but you can't go out again holding, let's say, a teva. Teva is a container, a chest. Kupa is a box. Machatzelas is a reed mat. You can't go ahead and put any of these things over you to protect you from the rain. But so take a look for just a moment at the Ran. So the Ran is 5 lines up from the bottom. First word on the line is Ava. So it's Yotzim B'Sak Ava B'Shabbos V'lo Mina Masoyu. So we'll say in all these cases, you're allowed to go ahead and wear these items out on Shabbos, and we do not say that it is a masa, that it is something that's a burden that you're carrying. Masoy, below sak mamish elakain sak. Fine. So back to the Gemara. Avalo b'tevelo b'kover haroim yotzim b'sakim below. So the shepherds can go out wearing sackcloth on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, good. Below roim bilva, not only shepherds. The truth is, anyone can actually go out wearing a sackcloth because of the rain. But rather, so why did the Gemara mention Roim shepherds? Because again, it was common for shepherds to wear sackcloth to protect them from the elements. Good. Rabbi Huda Omer Kolafi, I know. They're supposed to. Rabbi Huda introduced this very new and novel concept that not only do we interpret Nedarim ultimately by word choices, but we also interpret Nedarim based on circumstances. We look at a person's circumstances. So says the Gemara, Tanya, Gemara quotes a brayso, Keisat Rabbi Huda Kolafi Ano there. In what situation did Rabbi Huda say that we interpret a person's neder based on their circumstances? So for example, Haya Lavush Tsemer Bahatzer. Let's say a person was wearing wool, right? And it was, Hatzer means tsar. And ultimately, again, it became very uncomfortable for him. But Amar, Konam Semer Ola Alai, and he made a neder. Konam, right? Semer, right? Wool should not come upon me. So what's talacha? Asr lilbosh umuter liton. He's prohibited to wear wool clothing, but he is permitted to what? Carry wool on his back. I will say, because again, what we do is we look at the neder. In this particular case, Rabbi Huda is looking at the neder as a statement reflecting the discomfort of his current circumstances. So if currently he's wearing wool clothing and he's making the neder, I'm going to make a neder not to have any wool on me, we look at that as a neder against wool clothing, but not a neder against carrying wool on his back. Conversely, hayaton pishtan, let's say he was carrying wool on his back, and then what happened? Vizia, and he was sweating. Va'amar, Konam pishtam ola alai, and he says again, Konam, I make a neder that pishtan should not come upon me. So mutar lilbosh va'asar liton. He's permitted to wear wool clothing, but he's not permitted to go ahead and carry wool on his back. So again, I will say, Rabbi Huda introducing this really fascinating, and this by the way, have the Rambam Paskins, that is circumstances like this, where it's clear that it's not just the word choices, but it's the circumstances that are generating or that are propelling him towards making this neder. We do look at his current circumstances as a way of defining the nature and scope of his neder. Really interesting. Good. We'll say top of Nun Vav, top of 56, the Mishnah. Hanoja min Abayis. Very interesting case. A person makes a neder not to go ahead and get benefit from the home. That's the neder that he's making. I make a neder that I'm not going to get benefit from the home. What's that? Mutter ba'aliyah. He is permitted to go ahead and get benefit from the aliyah, from the upper story. Upper story. Okay, now we'll say, now it's Dear Rabbi Meir. These words are Rabbi Meir. So what Rabbi Meir is saying is like this. Remember, same principle. Ben Nedarim holchin achar lo shomani adam. When it comes to Nedarim, we look at the way people speak. Rabbi Meir says when people speak about a bias, what are they referring to? first floor of the domicile. What are they not referring to? They're not referring to, ultimately, again, the second floor, the aliyah, the second floor. Fine. So that's Rabbi Meir. Chum the Chum say, no. Aliyah bichlal habayis. Not true. The second floor, ultimately, again, is included in the home. It's all included in the home. When you say bayis colloquially refers to the entire structure. So fundamental machlokes. Hanodra min aliyah. Conversely, I will say everyone agrees that if you make a neder not to get benefit from the aliyah, from the upper story, mutter babayis. In that case, you are permitted to get benefit from them. Because I will say, remember again, bayis, the Chama will say, let's go over the Chama for just a moment. Chama will agree that bayis includes aliyah, right? But aliyah doesn't include bayis, right? Remember, bayis, because it's a general term, well, according to the Chama, will include all parts of the structure. Aliyah, which is incredibly specific, all right? Aliyah means second story. Aliyah only includes aliyah, doesn't include bayis. Good. Let's see the Gemara. Says the Gemara, man tana babayis l'rabos es hayitzia, babayis rabos es haliyah. So let's take a step back here. Now we're transitioning a little bit to talk about a different topic, which is tsaras babatim. There's a concept we know again that tsaras, right? What we'll translate as leprosy, but it's not really leprosy. Tsaras not only impacts the individual, their body and their clothing, but there's a concept called tsaras habatim. It's leprosy of the home as well. Listen, I just point out, interestingly enough, as much as we understand that tsaras in general is a physical sign of a spiritual ailment, right? As Rashi points out again in Parshas Metzora or Parshas Tazria, already that often, quoting the Gemara, that tsaras was often considered to be a punishment of lashon hara. Rashi points out that tsaras habatim was often perceived as a bracha. Why? Because Rashi points out that when Klal Yisrael was coming to conquer Eretz Yisrael, first under Moshe, then under Yoshua, so the indigenous nations, they hid their wealth in the walls of the home. So ultimately, again, the Jewish occupants of the home would never realize that there was buried treasure. So what would happen? There would come tsaras. Tsaras often requires, again, removal of certain parts of the house, especially the ones that have the blemishes, and they would discover the treasures that were buried inside of the wall. So an incredible idea, and obviously an incredible Moshe Haskell as well, how sometimes the things that look so terrible and detrimental in life, right? Can you imagine? You get tsaras habatim, it's not so pashit. You often have to move out, right? You have to take down some walls, take down some things. How often the things that look terrible and that look like they are destructive often pave the way for such incredible, beautiful life treasure. Incredible metaphor. So the Gemara said, well, not just a metaphor, incredible halacha. So in any event, that's what's happening over here. So the pasuk that the Gemara is focusing on over here is like this. Let me read you the pasuk. Kisavo el eretz, Kisavo el eretz Canaan, asharnino sein lochem lachuza. When you will come to Canaan, that I'm giving you as an inheritance, then asati nega saraas bebeis eretz achuzaschem. I will give you a nega tsaras, like a tsaras lesion, a tsaras, tsaras nega, in the house, bebeis eretz achuzaschem, in the house of the land which you have inherited. So now watch this. So the Gemara says, what does beveis, right? What does beveis ultimately teach me? The Rabbi says hayitzia. So I'll say, listen to this. Yitzia literally means like a terrace, right? A gazebo, a veranda. Let's say a person has a structure that extends outside of their house. So Babayis comes to teach me that the concept of tsaras in the home applies even to a structure that's outside of my home, that's attached to my home. Interesting halacha, right? Furthermore, here's the part we're focusing on. Bebeis l'rabos es ha'aliyah. So we'll say, what does bebeis come to include? Also the upper story. Now we'll say, what do you see from here? You see that bayis includes upper story. So the Gemara says, well, whose opinion is this? Now let's go back to the Mishnah. Remember again, in the Mishnah we had, a person makes a neder not to get hana from the bayis. We had a machlokes about what? Whether or not does bayis include aliyah, not include aliyah. So whose opinion is reflected in this brisa by tsaras? So the Gemara says, Amrav Chista, Rabbi Meir, it's Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that in general, when you speak about bayis, ultimately, it doesn't include aliyah. Now, I will say, let's just understand what's happening over here. The Gemara is making a drasha Remember, what's the point of a drasha? The point of a drasha is to include something that you would not have otherwise thought to include based on the pshat of the pasuk. So the Torah speaks about saras babatim. So now the Gemara is darshaning bebayis or bebeis comes to also include an aliyah. So I will say, who is the one who says you need an additional drasha to include an aliyah? It's Rabbi Meir. Because remember again, according to the Chachamim, aliyah is always included in bayis. You don't need a drasha to teach me that aliyah is included. I don't need l'rabos es ha'aliyah. I was about to say, what's interesting about this price is, the price is using bayis to include an external structure, like a yitzia, and also an aliyah, which indicates, just like I will say, I don't automatically assume that the yitzia is part of the home. I wouldn't automatically assume that the aliyah is part of the home. Who is the opinion who says that a second story isn't quote unquote included in what we call the typical definition of a bias? That's Rabbi Meir. That's Rabbi Meir, Di'i Rabbanon, because it's going to the Rabbanon, Ham Rabbanon aliyah b'chlal abayis. Because going to the Rabbanon, an aliyah, an upper story, by definition is included in the bias. Lama li kra bebayis, or the bebeis, l'ribuya. So as according to Chachamim, I don't need a drasha by tsaras to include an upper story. I don't need that. I don't need that because it's understood ultimately again that an upper story is included in bias. Only according to Rabbi Meir do I need the extra drasha. So Abaye says no, not necessarily. It could be that by the case of tsaras, the drasha is necessary even according to the Rabbanon. Why? I would have thought like this was very interesting. Beveis eretz achuzaschem ksiv. The Torah, when speaking about saras on the home, calls it bebeis eretz achuzaschem. In the home that's on the land of your inheritance. I would have thought halo mecharer ba'ara. I'm sorry. I skipped. The mecharer ba'ara shmei bayis. Halo mecharer ba'ara. So I'll say, interestingly enough, I would have thought maybe by saras the Torah used lashon of beis eretz achuzaschem. Which bias, which home is ultimately subject to the din of tsaras? Which home? Only the home that is mechuber la'aretz. Only the part of the home that's directly connected to the ground. What's the part of the home directly connected to the ground? The first story. But maybe the second story, the aliyah, is not subject to the halachos of tsaras babatim because it's not directly connected to the ground. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, even according to the Rabbanon, this drasha may be necessary. Good. Kiman azlahada amar Rafuna barchia mishmei duula. So we'll say ultimately again, whose opinion is reflected in the following statement. Listen to this. So we'll say, so again, just to follow the chain of events over here. The Mishnah started with a neder. Neder is the guy saying konam bayis alai. Right? Ultimately, again, I'm not going to get benefit from the home. What are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out what's included in the neder. Rabbi Meir, first floor only, not second floor. Rabbanon, no. Bias means everything. First floor and second floor. We then bring a case from Tsaras. And in the case of Tsaras, ultimately again, Torah tells me, Beveis comes to include. I need a drasha to include second story. Whose opinion is that? That's Rabbi Meir, who holds that aliyah is not included in bayis, which is not necessarily, can even be according to the Rabbanon, since the Torah uses such a strong relation of bebeis eretz achuz aschem. Maybe I would have thought only the part of the home that's attached to the ground, but the upper story is not included in saras abatim. Kamash malon bebeis, even the upper story is included. Good. Now we're transitioning to another case. Very exciting. A lot of home cases today. So we start with home by saras. We go afterwards to, we start by home by Nedarim, we then go to home by Tzaras, now we go to home in Choshen Mishpat, in the laws of real estate sales. Watch this. This is an interesting case. Kiman az lahadam ravuna barchia mishmei deula. Bayis bevesi ani mochelecha. Listen to this, what I was saying. Let's say I go over to Reuven. I say, Reuven, I'm selling you bayis bevesi, a home in my home. That's the lashon of the sale. A home in my home, I'm selling to you. So I say, so now what's the halacha? Marehu aliyah, Marehu aliyah. So listen to this. I can go ahead and, after the fact, claim to Reuven, I only sold you the upper story of my home. Bayis v'bayis. Oh, so that's the lashon. And apparently, what's the lashon? What's the wording these? Reuven bought it, was sight unseen. Sight unseen, right? So I sell him bayis v'bayis. He thinks he's getting a good deal. He thought he was buying something else. I tell him, no. I sold you the upper story of my home. Upper story. Now, the reason that works is because I use lashon of bayis bevesi, a home in my home. In other words, they will say, what is that lashon? What's the connotation of that lashon? Not my primary home. Not my primary home. So again, bayis bevesi. The Gemara says, aval bayis stam enomar ehu aliyah. But if I just say I'm selling you my home, stam, right, just unqualified home, then I will say what? I can't claim to Ruvain that I sold in the upper story. What do you see from here? That aliyah is not included in bias, right? That's what you see from here. In other words, the reason I could claim Reuven, I sold you my aliyah is because I used the lashon of bias bebias, right? The home in the home. Had I just said bias, I could not claim that I was selling him the upper story. Whose opinion is this? Lema Rabbi Meir. We'll say once again, this seems to reflect the view of Rabbi Meir that an aliyah, an upper story, is not included in the stam definition of a bias. Bless you. To which the Gemara says, not necessarily. My aliyah, perhaps what does aliyah mean? Mu'ula shebebatim. So we'll say it's quite possible that according to the Rabbanon, this could be true as well, because perhaps what does aliyah mean? Aliyah, we'll say maybe doesn't mean second story. In other words, when he says bias, remember again, what did the Brisa say? I say to Reuven, I'm selling you bias shebebayis. I'm selling you the home in the home. So the Gemara said, I could even claim to Reuven that I'm showing him the aliyah. So we assume that aliyah means upper story, in which case this brisa is a support for the position of Rabbi Meir, that in general an upper story is not included in the bias. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. It could very well be that even halacha l'maaseh this reflects the view of the Rabbanon. And what's bias? What's aliyah? Maybe the mu'ula, the best of the homes, which is interesting. So when I say to Reuven, I'm selling you the bias shebebayis, perhaps according to Rabbanan, what I'm selling him is what? The best of my homes. If there are multiple homes in my personal portfolio, when I sell him a bias shebebayis, what I'm actually agreeing to is selling him the nicest or the best of all of the homes which I own. If you look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says pretty much halfway down in the short lines, Mu'ula shebenechasav, habayis hameshubach shebebesav, sarich litin lo hecha dekomer bayis shebebeisi. Good. So we'll say, so therefore again, halacha l'maaseh, that last case is not a raya for Rabbi Meir or the Rabbanon. Good. So therefore we'll say what we emerge from here is that halacha l'maaseh, we pass like the Chachamim, that in general, if a person makes a neder not to get benefit from the bias and aliyah, an upper story is included in the bias. We do not pass like Rabbi Meir, we pass like the Chacham. Beautiful. Well, it says in the Mishnah, another interesting case. Hanodim min amita. Interesting case. A person makes a neder not to get benefit from a bed. So what's the halacha? Muder b'dargosh. He's allowed to get benefit from a dargosh. Now, what's a dargosh? That Amir Hashem will have to see. He's permitted to get benefit from dargosh. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. However, the Gemara says, V'cham say dargosh b'chlal mita. No, dargosh is included in a bed. Dargosh is included in a bed, and therefore, again, if you make a neder not to get benefit from the bed, you also can't get benefit from the dargosh. So the Gemara says, Hanoder. Good. Hanoder min dargosh mutar b'mita. I will say, but here's what the opposite is true. In other words, everyone agrees with the opposite. If you make a neder from a dargosh, ultimately, again, you can get benefit from a bed. So we'll say, you begin to see a theme over here. There's an ongoing machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanon about whether or not certain general terms also include more specific items, right? So remember again, it started before. A person makes a neder from a bias. The Chacham say bias includes everything, right? Bias and aliyah. Meir says, no. Bias only includes first floor, not second floor. Person makes a neder not to get benefit from a bed, right? Right. So Rabbi Meir says, right? So Rabbi Meir says, bed doesn't include dargosh. Something more specific. Chacham say no, bed includes everything in the bed family. Fine, so that's the machlokes. But the reverse everyone agrees with, which means if you make a neder on the specific item, so in other words, their machlokes is you make a neder on a general term. Does the general term include all of these specific items? Does bayis include aliyah? Does mita include dargosh? That's the machlokes. But they agree on the reverse, which is if you make a neder on the specific item, namely what? It does not include the general item. So if you make a neder not to get benefit from an aliyah, everyone agrees it doesn't include the first floor, bias. You make a neder not to get benefit from a dargosh, whatever that is, right? Everyone agrees that you can get benefits from the mita. Good. So let's say my dargosh. By the way, what's a dargosh? What's the dargosh? Amar Ulabas is very interesting. Arsa digada. Okay, that's helpful, right? So we'll say, so what's arsa digada? Take a look at Rashi. This is actually quite interesting. So Rashi says arsa digada. Rashi is actually right across in the Mishnah. Arsa digada mita she'archen osal mazel ve'ein shum adam yashin alav. So we'll say this was a bed that ultimately again was set up for mazel, for good luck. I'm going to go out. We'll say so. The Rosh actually points us to a Gemara in Maseches Shabbos. It's interesting. He calls Shabbos and Pesachim. So we'll say here the Gemara discusses like this: people would often set up a bed that was supposed to represent the bed for your malach who watches over you. Right? There are concepts. We have this concept of Mimini Michael, Nismoni Gavriel, right? The malachim who ultimately follow us throughout the entire day. This is actually talking about the Gemara Masechah Shabbos says that when a person comes home from shul on Friday night, there are two malachei asharis, two angels that accompany him into his home, and they want to see what the home is like on Shabbos. So the Gemara says this arsa digata, this was a special bed that you would set up for your watchful malachim, right? For your ministering angels. This bed would not be used. It would not be used. It was set up. It was more like a ceremonial bed, and it was there in the house. Arsa de Gada. So there's a lot more to talk about. There's a whole discussion about. It doesn't sound very Jewish, right? To go ahead and start setting up beds for malachim, and we don't use it. So we'll say it's fascinating. So the Rush points out over here on this sugya that and this is actually very, very apropos. This actually is a Baruch Shema bris in shul today, a little bit later on, and we know that one of the interesting things that we do, Baruch Hashem in a bris, is a kisei she'elio. So the Rush points out over here the concept of kisei she'elio ultimately comes from this arsa digada, right? So this concept of setting up. Okay, we do a chair. They did a bed. Right? And remember again, it's now so far off because also remember again, didn't necessarily sit on chairs, they reclined. Right? They recline. So a bed also would be something that a person would normally sit on. So this is the arsa de gada. Good. So the Gemara says, Amrli Rabban le'ula. Hadisna. So we'll say, so here's what's interesting. So now the machlokes makes a bit more sense, actually. So remember what's happening over here. Person makes a neder not to get benefit from a bed. So the shaila is, so the Chachamim will say that bed includes everything, even the dargosh. So Ula says, no, it doesn't include the dargosh. Bed really only includes things that you normally use. Dargosh was not commonly used. So the Gemara says like this. So Rabbanan said to Ula, so here's the problem with this interpretation. Hadisnan, but that's what you learn. So we'll say now the Gemara is quoting over here from Maseches Berachos. Hadisnan, so now Maseches Berachos, Moed Cotton. So the Gemara says, Hadisnan, Kishim Mevarin also. So we'll say, so remember again, this is the halacha by avelos. So someone is sitting shiva. So remember again, mevarin refers to the sudas havra. When the avel would come back from the cemetery after burial, so the community provides their first meal. So kishay mevarin also, kala am mesubin ala ares. So everyone is sitting on the ground. V'hu mesav al hadargosh, and he sits on the dargosh. Fascinating. So we'll say, so according to this Mishnah over here, the Avel sits on the Dargosh during his Sudas Havra, right, during his meal of consolation. So here's the problem. If you say that Dargosh is this bed that was set up for the Malach, Kula Shasalo Yosiv Aleyahu Yomi Yosiv Ale, does it make sense? A whole year, you're not sitting on the Dargosh. And now during Shiva, he sits on the dargosh. It just seems so strange. And Shiva, you're not even sitting on a regular chair. So now the whole year I'm not sitting on the dargosh. Now during Shiva, he's going to sit on the dargosh. To which the Gemara says, yeah. Maskif Ravina. So Ravina said, yes. I'll tell you why. Midi dahava basar v'yayin. It's no different than meat and wine. How so? The kula shasa I by achil, the I by lo achil. You're supposed to say throughout an entire year. If you want to eat and drink meat and wine, you could eat and drink meat and wine. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. Hahu yoma ananya vinale. I will say for the Sudas Havra, we would dafka give the Avel meat and wine. Now, what was the logic of giving them meat and wine? The idea was to lift them up. Also, we've spoken about this many times, that in fact, again, one of the most interesting practices, right, Avelis practices of the Gemara was what was called the Kos Shal Tanchumin, the cup of consolation. What was the cup of consolation? It was a big gulp, right? It was a huge glass of wine. And the whole point of this was to go ahead and take the edge off the suffering. That's exactly what it was designed for. So the Gemara says it's not surprising that the Avel does certain things during Avelos that maybe he doesn't do throughout the year. So normally during the year he wants to eat meat, wants to drink wine, that's his business. During Avelos, we dafkatam for the Sudas Harad, this is a mitzvah for you to go ahead and eat this and drink this to lift them up a little bit. So it's quite possible, it's actually quite beautiful. So it's quite possible that although during the year you're not sitting on the dargosh, maybe dafka during Avelos is when we put the Avel on the dargosh, almost a way of saying what? We want your mazel to improve, right? You're going through a difficult time right now, but your mazel is going to improve. Rabbi, I just point out, the Ran actually points out that this particular mission that we're quoting over here is actually talking about a Kohen Gadol who became an Avel. That it could very well be that for regular people, they would not sit on the dargosh. It's perhaps a din in the Kohen Gadol when he becomes an Avel. He's sitting on the dargosh and everyone else is sitting on the floor comforting him. Okay. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, Ella hakasha. So we'll say, so now we're going with our definition of Ula, right? Ula is telling us what's the dargosh. So Ula is telling us ultimately, again, it is this malach bed, this mazel bed. So it says the Gemara, Ella hakasha. Rather, here's the question. Disanyo, dargosh lo hayakofeu, Ella zokvo. Well, listen to this. So there's a concept in Avelos of kfiyas samita, which means that the halacha is you overturn the beds in the home. And I will say, we do not observe contemporarily the din of kfiyas mita. So the Gesher Chaim brings down the reason for this is as follows. Because it used to be, their mattresses were made of straw. So when you sleep in straw, what happens over time? I don't know what happens over time when you sleep in straw, but what the Gesher Chaim brings down is that the straw takes the form of the body. Right? I guess it's like, what do they call those mattresses today? What is it? Tempur-Pedic, right? So you see, life is a full circle. Life is a full circle, right? Today we pay extra money for this, right? Yeah, in the times of the Gemara was just the norm. So let's say, so what would happen? So you would sleep in the straw, take on the form. So death is considered to be the erasure of the human form. Part of the way in which they gave expression to this is they would turn over the beds in the home. That's called kfiyas mita. So the Gemara says as follows. So, fine. So the Gemara says, you don't have to overturn the dargosh. Rather, what do you do with the dargosh? You just stand it up. You stand it up. So the Gemara says, if you say that dargosh was this malach bed or this mazel bed, Vatanya we learned, hakofa es mitaso, a novel has to overturn his bed. V'lo mitaso bilva, not only his bed. So the Gemara says hukofa. Elo kol mito sheyish lo b'soch habayis hukofa. Rather, you have to overturn all beds in the home. You have to overturn all the beds in the home. To which the Gemara says, it's a kasha. Halo kasha. It's not a contradiction. Why? So so here's the shaila. If dargosh is just a regular bed, then the halacha is what has to happen in the home of an avel. All the beds are overturned. Here we're saying a dargosh does not have to be overturned. It just has to be what? Stood up. Right? You stand up the dargosh. So what's going on over here? Halokashya, Amud Beis. Well, I'll say Amud Beis. So midi dahava amita miyuchedes lekelim. So we'll say it's actually very interesting. The Gemara says perhaps the dargosh is considered to be like a bed that's not normally used for sleeping or for sitting, but rather is used to put stuff on. In other words, we'll say sometimes you'd have a bed in your home. A bed in your home that wasn't used for sitting or for sleeping, but rather, what would you do with it? You'd put your clothing on it. It's like a treadmill, right? You'd go you go ahead, right? You put your clothing on it. So I'll say, so ultimately, again, now there's actually an interesting halacha. The Gemara says, "Desanya im haisa mita hamiyuchedes lekelim ein tzarich lekfos." And I will say, now it makes much more sense. If you have a bed that's not used for sleeping, or ultimately, again, for sitting, there's no din of overturning it, which I will say makes sense. In other words, if the whole din of kfiyas samita is because the bed that is used for sitting or for sleeping ultimately takes on the form of the person, therefore death represents the erasure of the human form. Therefore, you have to overturn that bed. A bed that is not used for sitting or for sleeping would not require overturning. So that, again, an example of that is a bed you use for storage. You put stuff on it. Therefore, halacha l'maisa could be that a dargosh, now we'll say, not that you would be using a dargosh to put stuff on, but Pashas people didn't use that. But again, it's like a bed used for items in that it's not used typically for sitting or sleeping. Such a bed like that does not require overturning. So the Gemara says, Elo ikasha akasha. So again, what we're trying to kind of do over here is raise questions or point out contradictions towards Ula's definition. Remember again, let's go back to the Mishnah. What are we doing? Right? A person made a neder, konam mita alai, right? I'm not allowed to get benefit from this bed. So what are we trying to figure out? So the Chum say, what's included in a bed? Dargosh. Oh, right, Rabbi Meir, dargosh is not included. What's a dargosh? So right now, the Gemara is working with Ula's definition. Dargosh is arsa de gada. This bed of mazel, the bed of the malach. So all we're doing is we're trying to raise contradictions to that definition. Ela ikasha hakasha. The Gemara says, here's the contradiction. This sign here we go. Very interesting. Rabbi Shimon Omer, dargosh matir karbita v'unofam. So we'll say this is still a din over here. In Avelos. So one of the interesting things by Avelos is what you could also do is instead of overturning the bed, what you could do literally again, matir karbitov, you go ahead and you untie the knots or untie the loops, and it falls by itself. In other words, we'll say the image of the bed that the Gemara is making this. If you could imagine, you have a frame, right? In the frame, in the sides of the frame, you have holes. Then you have, if you can imagine, like a sheet or a piece of fabric. It could be leather, as we're going to see, or it could be cotton, or it could be flax, or it could be whatever you want. And what you would do is the end of the sheet, if you could imagine, would have strings. You would tie the strings into the holes of the sides of the frame, and that essentially, good, got your picture right, and that essentially would go ahead and create, I guess, what contemporarily would be called your box spring, right, or your mattress. Good, and that's what you sleep on. So the Gemara says, Matir karbita v'unofam elav. For Avelos, you could simply go ahead and untie the strings, and we'll call it the box spring or the mattress falls down by itself. That's the din in the dargosh. Now we'll say, take a look, if you look by the way for just a moment at Tosas. Tosas will say in the right hand column, Tosas says, dargosh matir karbita va'ar nofel, karbitov lulos shemecharbe memitu kshurim ba'ar. So we'll say, the karbitov, these are the loops. Now, when he says loops, what he means is, if you could imagine for a moment, you have a piece of leather, right? The big piece of leather. At the sides of the leather, you have strings that come off it. You tie those strings into the sides of the bed frame. There are holes in the sides of the bed frame. You tie the strings there. So for Avelos, you can untie the strings, and the leather just falls to the ground. The dargush arsa de gada, and if the dargush is an arsa de gada, so the Gemara says, karbitin mi isle, why would it have karbitin? In other words, we'll say, why would it have karbitin? Now, interestingly enough, in Talmudic bed technology, there are two different ways to make beds, right? One of the ways is the way we just described, where you take a piece of material, it has strings on the end, and you tie those strings into holes on the sides of the bed frame. Other way to do it is, you take a piece of material, you stretch it over the bed frame, right? Stretch it over the bed frame. Now, we'll say, generally, permanent beds were made the second way. Take a piece of material, spread it over the bed frame. More temporary beds were made in the first way, where you tied into the sides of the bed frame. So we assume that a dargosh would be something of a more permanent nature. So why are you making the dargosh with tying these threads or tying these strings into the side of the bed frame? To which the Gemara says, So again, when Rabban came along, he said, I asked this question to one of the Rabbanon. The man in question, his name was Rav Tachlifa bar Ma'arva, the Veshkiach Beshuka Detzali. And he told me, and he often spent a lot of time in the shuk, in the marketplace of the leather workers, and he said to me, my dargush, what is dargush? Arsa Detzala. So we'll say, interesting enough, what's a dargush? Dargush is Arsa Detzala. What does that mean? Take a look at the Ran, right hand side, second line down from the top, Arsa Detzala, Mita Shal Ar. So I will say he's actually giving a different definition. He says that a dargosh is a bed made of leather. V'tolin rutzuos b'svas ha'ar saviv ukisherotzim lintosa onvin haratzuos baruchos hamita, ukishematirin osan nofal me'elav, vehein hein karbitov, ukadesh yiskalkel or belichluch hakarkush le'rosh kar. So I'll say. So again, we're giving a different definition. Maybe arsa. Maybe dargosh is not this arsa deguda, but rather it's this arsa detzali, which Rabbi says, as we described before, it's this bed that's made. You have a wooden frame. The wooden frame has holes in the sides. You take a piece of leather, a strong piece of leather. It has strings coming off the sides in the corner. You tie the piece of leather into the bed frame itself, into the holes of the side of the bed frame, and that's how you create the bed. Itmar ezuhu mitavezu dargosh. What's a bed and what's a dargosh? Rabbi Yirmiyah, mita misagin osa algav. As I just mentioned before, a mita, you take the piece of material and you wrap it over the bed frame. Dargosh misagin osa migufo. A dargosh, you take what we'll call the piece of material and you tie it into the bed frame. Right? So as opposed to being wrapped over the bed frame, it's tied into the bed frame. We'll say if you have a wooden utensil, at what point in time is the wooden utensil mekabel tuma? Sahamita v'ha'arisa mishiyashvum ba'or hadag. So we'll say a bed, Ramita is a bed, arisa is a cradle. When you go ahead and you smear the wood with fish oil, or I should say with the skin of a fish. So we'll say, in other words, if you are making a bed, when is the bed finished? When you smear it with fish skin. Okay, it gives it a finish, gives it a coating. Here's the problem. V'i mita mistareges hagapa lamali shifas or hadak. Now, we'll say, here's the problem. We just said, how do you make a bed? You take the material and you wrap it over the frame. If you're wrapping it over the frame, then what? Why do you have to smear the frame with fish oil or with fish skin? After all, again, the frame is going to be covered by the material. To which the Gemara says, Ela hava hamigufan. Rather, you're right. Both a bed and a dargosh are made the same way in that what we'll call the piece of material is not wrapped over the frame, but rather what? It's put inside of the frame and tied to holes inside the frame. So the Gemara says, so what's the difference? Elahava migufan, mita auli va'afuki bebizni, dargash auli va'afuki ba'avakta. So it's very interesting. A mita, the actual strings that came off the sides of the material was tied into the frame itself. A dargash, Rabosai, the frame would have a loop that was attached to the frame, and the strings on the end of the material would be tied into the loop. Right? So one was tied directly to the frame itself, the other, the dargosh, was tied to a loop inside of the frame. All right, interesting. So the Gemara says as follows. Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha Amar Rabbi, Mita shenachlitea yotzin zokvin v'daus. So just transitioning back to Avelos for just a second. If you have a bed, this essentially is describing a canopy bed. So imagine you have a canopy bed, a bed with a pole at the foot, middle of the foot, and a pole at the middle of the head, and you would put a canopy over it, like but not a canopy, with 4 poles, more like a tent canopy. So what's the now by Avelos? What do you do by kfiyah samita for such a bed like that? So zokfin v'dayu, you don't have to turn it over because you can't turn it over because of you could deconstruct the canopy. You're not obligated to deconstruct the canopy. Rather, what? Just stand up that bed on the side, rendering it useless. Amr Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, Amr Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Both say ultimately again, halacha follows Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, namely that by Avelus, when it comes to a dargosh, all you have to do is what? Untie the strings of the dargosh, and the mattress, so to speak, of the piece of material just simply falls to the ground. That's why I'm asking Avelus. So both say halacha lamai. So once again over here, we paskin like the Chachamim. Therefore, again, if you make a neder not to get benefit from the bed, included in the bed is a dargosh. The Gemara also accepts the opinion of Ula that ultimately, again, the real definition. It seems to be, however, dargosh is used in a couple of different ways. Either dargosh could just mean a type of bed that's made by attaching the piece of fabric to a piece of fabric, ultimately, again, to the loop in the bed frame. Or dargush could ultimately mean what was the lashon of Ula? Arsa digada, the type of nozzle. But good, either definition works. Also within our context, we'll stop over here. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you, Zemi. Thank you.